coming from an art background and not from a scientific background, I think that how I approach it is I feel we're all going to be affected by the technology. And so maybe trying to introduce some of the applications and cutting through the jargon might be helpful.
Hey, Erum, how's it going?
It's going, just enjoying some summertime fun. Been traveling locally, and by locally, I mean I went across to East Long Island, which is the Hamptons, Sag Harbor, that whole area. And wow, what an interesting place.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've been there. And for Grow Everything listeners, we typically talk about biology as technology on this podcast, but we always kick it off by talking about what we're doing. And the Hamptons is so famous. It's another world away. It's been a long time since I've been out there. I always avoid it just because it's a lot of traffic. How long did it take you to get there?
Well, I took the train. So the LIRR takes you there, which is really nice. I just was reading. And actually, I was also doing some chatting with Nova and worked on some things I'll tell you about later. But that was fun. It's always good to have a friend to talk to. Sorry, I was chatting with ChatGPT. If you guys didn't catch that, ChatGPT revealed itself as Nova to me. So Karl and I refer to ChatGPT as Nova. So it was chatting with Nova on the way there. I have a friend that has a house there, and it's in the town called Wainscott, which is smaller. And then we went to the small town. So we didn't go to the big Hamptons. We went to like the small towns. I mentioned Sag Harbor. And Sag Harbor is so interesting because it was a whaling town back in the day, in the 1800s. And that's how it really became famous. I mean, it became a whaling village. And so we went to the whaling museum, and wow, what a time in American culture. They saw the techniques from Native Americans, they meaning the Europeans that came over and settled. But in Sag Harbor, they had ships that were meant for whaling, and it was the electricity, the energy, the fuel of its time. So whale oil was used in everything. And it was a dangerous activity, of course, but it was in all these different products. The blubber was rendered down for fueling lamps, and so that provided light, and then it was in makeup, and it was in medicine, it was in everything. Blubber was in everything. And it's so interesting because it came from biology, from whales, right? But whaling stopped immediately after people discovered petroleum and oil and kerosene. And that took over. It was easier to extract. It was easier to do, less death. And so goodbye whales, hello petroleum. And that kicked off this petrochemical dependency that we live in today. So it was interesting to see. But then you see the wealth. The thing is, when you're in Sag Harbor right now, it's just a lot of fancy people, everyone wearing seersucker, pastel colored, vintage cars all around, beautiful stores and exclusive shops. The Goop stores up there, Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow's wellness beauty line is there. And so I went to that store, and it's very wealthy. And my friend, her family, they're wealthy too. And she was telling me all about the whaling history of Sag Harbor, and took me to the museum, and we just like really absorbed the culture of that time and saw how it evolved. And it was amazing commentary of how we had this bioeconomy, that we did this very hard thing of catching a whale and then using every part of it as a resource. And then petrochemistry came, and then we kind of just like, nah, I'm not going to do that anymore, which is great because, again, it was dangerous. But now here we are.
Well, fun fact, earlier in the summer, before I traveled to Spain, I did read a book called The Basque History of the World. And the Basques were actually the first to hunt. I mean, probably Native Americans were hunting whales too, but they were the first in Europe to hunt whales because the Bay of Biscay had whales in it. And so these guys would go out on these flat boats and they would hunt the whales that would come to the bay. But then they learned to build bigger ships. And these guys were sailing up into Newfoundland in the 12 and 1300s. Maybe the dates are wrong, but they were dominating the ocean. And I think just recently they found an old whaling ship that is pretty well preserved up there in Newfoundland that came from the Basque country. They really dominated that up until the 1700s. So it's this crazy industry that was around. And I mean, of course, Moby Dick is the American classic novel about whaling. It's super interesting. I don't know anything about it except for now I know Sag Harbor is a whaling town, and I knew that the Basques were involved in this industry. And yeah, you're right. They would use everything from these animals, these beasts. But I did hear some interesting whale news this last week, and I don't have the reference, but apparently whales are showing up in new places where they've never been before. And that's actually seen as a positive sign for the ocean. I mean, there's so much negative news, but that I thought was a really interesting piece of positive.
Why is it positive? And folks, you're hearing it first. Hard-hitting whale news. You're hearing it
on the Grow Everything podcast.
Why is it a positive? Because in my mind, it's without any research or storyline or anything that I've seen in the news. It seems they're probably trying to find better locations because where they live has been compromised somehow. Our neighborhood is being trashed, or there's something going on in our neighborhood. What's the source of all this garbage? But I don't know, where are they coming from and going to?
The miraculous revival of Australia's humpback highway. Apparently, 100,000 humpback whales swim somewhere between Antarctica and Australia. And that's something that hasn't happened in decades. So I don't know if that's because of climate change, but it seems there's a growing population of humpback whales.
Yeah, well, maybe their generational trauma from all the whaling that has happened over the years, they probably now maybe subsided and they're like, you know what? No one's whaling anymore. Let's do this big trip with 100,000 of us and we'll go from the Arctic to Australia and do the loop. We'll bring the loop back.
We'll show people that we're still around. I mean, I think whaling's been illegal for a long time. And I think the only two places that are allowed to hunt whales are Japan and Iceland. And they do it in very limited numbers. I think it's not like the buffalo hunt where they just decimated the buffalo population, which is very controversial. But I don't think whales were hunted that way, though I'm sure that there's many whales that are gone because of the whaling.
Yeah, because it's not easy. It's not easy. And there were guns, so there were a lot of harpoons that had to be made. But anyway, everyone, this is so interesting. When you think of whales, don't roll your eyes. Stop rolling your eyes and go to the Whale Museum in Sag Harbor. You'll be blown away.
And correct us on our whaling facts. So, okay, I've got two stories that I thought would make good before we get into the episode. But Erum, do you realize that you're carrying around a genetic manual that could save your life?
Where? How do I access it? Tell me more. I'm so confused.
Okay, so Penn Medical just did this study where they looked at young adults that went into the ICU, so the intensive care units, and they found that about a fourth of them had some genetic mutation that would have changed the way doctors treated them. Not rare diseases, these are common mutations that if the doctor had known might change the way they treat these people for whatever they were in the ICU part. And the crazy thing about this story, which we'll link to in the show notes, is that you only have to sequence 2% of your genome, the part that makes proteins, to really tell you whether someone has some genetic mutation that could impact your treatment. So bottom line is, a fourth of us all carry some kind of mutation that could change the way you're treated for a disease if you end up in the ICU. And we just don't do that on a regular basis. What's crazy about this story is we live in a world where Netflix knows what you want to watch at any given time, but doctors are still guessing your biology. And to me, this story reflects what we talk about a lot here on Grow Everything, that is, biology is infrastructure, and we don't have to wait for better science. We just need better implementation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, 100%. To me, it's like, why aren't we there yet, right? Remember, we had moderated this panel, and one of the questions I had for one of the panelists was, look, we have all this technology. When are we going to get that Netflix dashboard for our health where we can just see our data regularly? And the technology exists. So what's really stopping us, right? And it's just the thoughts around this are like, we have this healthcare establishment. Karl, you and I had this conversation offline about our own healthcare, and I'm still exploring doctors. I'll go to a new one every year. My recent experience, I brought like, hey, look, there are these supplements, there are these testing kits. What do you make of that? And then this doctor in particular was like, I don't trust supplements because they're not FDA regulated, which, okay, there's a lot of science and technology that we know that they're like generally regarded as safe, and some of them are, and you can find out. And then the testing kits, this doctor was like, I don't know if it's FDA regulated. So they just did not want to leave their medical establishment to be able to look at new innovation to then bring it to my healthcare experience. I was looking for a doctor who can look at innovation, look at the data, look at my willingness to try as long as things are safe, and help me, right? Be a guide. Don't just be the paternal system. Doctors are like parents and they say yes or no to you versus being a guide. And there's a lot of books around this. Eric Topol, he wrote a book called The Patient Will See You Now. That one's a really good one. But I'm glad to see that there's stories around, look, your genetic information holds a lot of personalized information about you that can create a medical treatment for you. And that's where we all have to go. But we're banging on this drum. I feel like a broken record, actually, at this point. And I think we all do. And we're all tired that these changes are coming slowly but surely. And I can go into this. I mean, there is innovation, but it's not coming as fast as we need it to.
Here's the bottom line. It's the cliche William Gibson quote. The future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Yeah. It's not evenly distributed. It's just not integrated. What's taking so long to integrate it? And I do want to say, I know people working in healthcare work really hard and they're doing everything. So I really appreciate all the doctors out there and the nurses and everyone. I applaud you for all the efforts. It's really hard. But to maybe the decision makers, the administrators, what can we do? What can we do to help the doctors and nurses that are at the bedside making decisions for individual people so that they can make it a more personalized experience and then less pressure and stress on these poor doctors and nurses that are seeing so many people. And we also there's shortages of these people. So when people are like, oh, AI is taking our jobs. Well, there's plenty of jobs in healthcare if you're a software developer and you want to help people.
All right, I've got one more story before we get into our guest. Erum, have you heard of the Wood Wide Web?
What are you talking about?
Okay, so this is so great because you're going to just love this. Scientists just mapped for the first time underground mushroom networks that connect plant roots across entire ecosystems. And they're saying that the mycorrhizal fungi are nature's original internet. So we know that plants trade nutrients, they share resources, they store carbon through these fungal cables that are buried beneath our feet. But it's the first time this has ever been mapped. And you're going to love this name. It's called SPUN, the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks. I'm not making it up, SPUN. These guys are mapping biological infrastructure that is so vast and so complicated that we're just barely beginning to understand what we've been walking on. And to me, this related to two things that we talk about a lot. One is we've talked a fair amount about AI. And one of the things that AI is really going to enable is ecosystem creation because of being able to map ecosystems much more precisely. We could guess now, you plant a bunch of trees, what's it going to do to the soil? But with things like this, what it shows is number one, biology already orchestrates. It doesn't have to invent. And number two, any company that masters this kind of biological collaboration that's building platforms and putting things together will own this next economic revolution. So nature has put 400 million years creating this prototype of the fungal internet. We're just now starting to map and understand that source code.
Amazing. That is so fascinating. We have to bring some of these researchers on to talk about what they're learning, how they are deciphering the code, because you mentioned nutrient and water exchange, communication. So what are they saying? Like alerting them to danger. So if there are some trees on fire, what are they telling other trees down the way? And what are those trees then doing to protect themselves? So it's interesting. I mean, let's get someone on here to talk about it. I think it's fascinating. I mean, I have seen videos of researchers that are hooking up a translator device to plants and flowers. Then it says, I'm thirsty or I'm hot. And it's actually in human language. And I've also seen them for pets as well. So I love it. What are we learning? And then how do we apply it to help nature, right? Not just to help humans. Humans are great. We have lots of things. It can also help humans, but we got to think on the ecosystem scale. We're all connected. We eat plants. We use trees and everything for building materials and packaging materials. So how do we tap into this wood wide web to make a more regenerative ecosystem?
All right. Well, speaking of spin, I don't even know if spin's around anymore. It was a pop culture magazine that focused a lot on music. We are going to have a great guest on today, Karen Ingram, who is a longtime friend of the pod, and she's part of our Brooklyn Biotech world. She has taught at GenSpace for many years. Erum, do you remember when you first met Karen?
I probably met her through you maybe like 8 or 9 years ago. There was a little proto ecosystem developing. You guys had called it New Bio City. There were a lot of people that were a part of that. Karen was a part of that. So I met her there and we had meetings and happy hours that we'd go to. And that was the first time I met her. But of course, see her regularly, being a part of our community, always a joy, ray of sunshine. Very cool work that she does. I mean, it's great to talk to her because she brings other disciplines to biology. Obviously, science and research is there, but art, design, education, messaging and marketing as well. And that's why she's such a kindred spirit. And it's always great to speak with her, which you guys will hear in today's episode.
Let's let Karen take it away.
All right. Karen Ingram, longtime friend, partner in crime, part of biotech in Brooklyn. We are so happy to get you on the Grow Everything podcast. And I actually have to apologize. We should have had you on a long time ago. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm happy to be here.
We have so much to cover. And I think we should set this up a little bit. Erum and I always do a little bit of an intro on our guests, but let's just set it up. Look, you've done media, you've done painting, you've done design, you've done textiles, you've done biotech, you've done surfboard fins, you've been in front of the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, you could correct me, you've done Times Squares, you paint with microbes. How did you even get started? What got you interested in biotech and the microbial frontier?
Oh, that's such a good question. I've always been interested in nature, and I am a painter by education. So I've always made art and always worked on design. And so what got me into the biotech space was I moved to New York in 2000 and started working in digital technology and advertising and marketing, and was part of this speaker series called the Empiricist League, which was a science-themed speaker series that was at bars in Brooklyn. It was super fun, and that's how actually I met some of the founders of GenSpace. And because I had been interested in digital technology, and that's what brought me to New York, I saw the bridge between digital technology and synthetic biology. And the dogma made a lot of sense to me. And it reflected back to my interest in naturalism and art and nature in general. I found a sweet spot in synbio and bioengineering. I saw it as an excellent place to be creative.
Yeah, wow. I love talking about the history because we are in this Brooklyn Biotech community. We call it the Brooklyn Biotech Mafia. You've been in it consistently and from the early beginning. So you just mentioned GenSpace founders before they even founded GenSpace, but you were hanging out with them at this, sounds really cool, Empiricist League. I wish that was still around. That sounds like a lot of fun. Can you just paint more of a picture of what it was like the early days? Because GenSpace is iconic and you've been a part of this crew. You also have come to this revelation while you're hanging out with them. Tell us, what were the times like back in the day?
Yeah, well, I mean, GenSpace, I'm not sure if we started the Empiricist League or GenSpace started first. I don't know which one happened first, but I think my first encounter with GenSpace was when Dan Grushkin spoke at this event that my partner, Lefty Leibowitz, and I had. And the theme of it was, I think it was human enhancement, which is really funny. But it was Dan and another guy named Wythe Marshall, and they spoke about gene editing. And I don't know, I started talking to Dan about GenSpace and got really interested and took some classes with Ellen Jorgensen and painted with bacteria, played with slime mold, played with C. elegans. This was at the old space, which was on Flatbush Avenue, and very raw space.
That's a nice way of saying it. I've had Sabria on, and she helped co-host a few episodes ago, and she called it a clown garage.
Yeah, that actually is a great descriptor for it. I think that's where I remember meeting you there, Karl. That was a while back. But yeah, so I met the GenSpace crew through the Empiricist League and just kept taking classes and kept hanging out with them. And we worked on a bioart show together a really long time ago. And that's really how I got interested in bioart and painting with microbes. We made a mosaic at South by Southwest. We had 200 tiles of bacterial art that made this unicorn mosaic. So yeah, it was all different participants from South by Southwest.
Amazing. That's amazing. At what point did that turn into your Petri dish paintings? You do these Petri dish paintings. I've seen them around for a while. They're called Biogenetic Blooms. How did you get to doing that? And if someone saw them, what would they experience? And I can add my 2 cents.
So I think that when I worked on that piece for South by Southwest, it was a crowdsourced project. So we had all different participants, but that was probably maybe 2014 or something like that. That's when that happened. It was a long time ago. And back then it was bacteria. It was E. coli and GFP and RFP E. coli. And it was interesting for me as a crowdsourced project because we let people paint whatever they wanted to, just as long as it was those colors. And then the colors is what made the image. Because of the size of it, the actual images didn't really matter. It was the color. But anyway, it was more interesting to me as a community project than as an independent practice. This goes back to Gen Space too. Beth Tuck, she knew about my work and she knew that I liked to paint. And she had acquired some yeast from the Boca Lab at NYU. And this yeast this was like baker's yeast or brewer's yeast that had been engineered to produce all these different colors from different sea creatures and metabolic pathways. And that was a very rich palette. There were probably about, I don't know, it varies, but I think at the time, maybe there were like 12 colors, which for me is fantastic. I was so excited to go from two very contrasting colors, GFP, RFP, to oranges and pinks and blues and purples. And I just started playing with them and started painting flowers with them and really had so much fun and taught a few classes with Beth, teaching people how to work with them. My background is in painting, or at least that's what I went to school for. And it felt a lot more painting or printmaking. And it felt more like an art form than the more novelty two-color bacteria. So yeah, that's how I got into it. And the way that I've displayed them, I displayed them at BioBat Art Space. And I think it's important for people to be able to see the Petri dishes if they can, once they're alive or when they're alive. So I try to bring them whenever I can, but I also photograph them at different points and then create prints of those. But they're alive and there's a very visceral feeling of a very visceral experience of seeing them, I think. And they, depending on what light you have them in, they look different. The lighting conditions matter a lot. They can either be really buttery or fluffy. You can light them from the back where they're a little bit more muted, a watercolor. So I don't know, it's fun for me.
Let me just paint the picture for our listeners. So I think the last time I saw these was at BioBat, and Karen is standing behind what looks to be an ice cream counter where you can look in at the different ice creams and maybe choose the flavor.
Yeah, it's a baking refrigerator.
Oh, so baking refrigerator. So instead, what you're seeing is these Petri dishes that have been painted on with these bacteria. And what Karen has done is paint these beautiful looking flowers. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how you do that, but they do change over time as the yeast changes. So you'll see these colors that might be the shape of a flower, but the shape is going to change over time. And it's really a beautiful experience, especially when Karen is there behind the counter explaining and showing you how they work or how they're going to change. And the pictures are very striking as well.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to go, but I've been fangirling you on Instagram, and we'll definitely link to that in the show notes. People can see the work, and it is really cool. I'm only looking at a picture, but I could just imagine how it shifts. And if you introduce other things into the Petri dish, have you explored multiple organisms? I'm just curious.
I mostly have been working with yeast, but I just started working with Corynebacterium and E. coli together. It's two different types of bacteria. But what I've been doing also is taking photographs of them as they incubate so that you can get a time lapse footage of them. So you can actually see them growing. That's pretty fun too. But the yeast in particular changes color as it cools because the bakery refrigerator that Karl was talking about, as they sit there, they tend to get richer in color. So after about 2 weeks until 2 months, during that time frame is when the colors are the most vibrant. They're very rich and beautiful.
Oh, interesting. Super interesting. And I loved how you talked about that you really enjoy the teaching aspect of it. So rather than your individual practice, which I'm sure you have enjoyment in that too, but for other people to experience it and educating them on it. And I didn't know this before we started recording. We were looking at creating questions and going deeper into your background, and we have an associate that helps us with that. And there's so much in your background that I'm learning, and I didn't know that you co-authored a piece with Natalie Kudell, who was actually on this pod too. Yeah, a book called BioBuilder. So, and that is the name of Natalie's organization, and it's to help make synthetic biology more teachable to teenagers. So in your teaching practice, what's the most surprising thing that you've learned about how young minds engage with the ethics of designing life?
In terms of the ethics of designing life, when I was working on BioBuilder, we put together a chapter that's devoted to ethics. And one of the things that I found the most interesting about that was the different ways that scientists and policymakers will talk about potential risks that are involved with working with microorganisms. And this is just something that you don't really think about that much. And I think that when you look at a scientist or anybody who's working in a scientific field, they may understand that with a new technology or innovation, there are unknown risks. And you can't really proclaim that it's totally safe, that anything is totally safe. So there's always an air of caution that goes into how you talk about things, how they might talk about something, whereas a policymaker is looking for very definitive information. And I think that is a tension that is not often highlighted. I've done some work with BioBuilder and, of course, since then with other educational programs where we try to unpack that, where I will ask somebody to come up with a great idea that involves technology, and then I'll ask them to critique it or come up with the idea, a solve that would maybe not use biotechnology, maybe use something else.
Yeah, I mean, I would just a quick follow-up. I'm just really curious to know, you're engaging with teenagers, you're teaching them about designing with biology, synthetic biology. Any interesting conversation that comes to mind? If you can think of a teenager who asked you a crazy question or came up with the interesting idea.
Yeah, that's a good question. I did some workshops. I'm out in the Rockaways, and I did some workshops with some teenagers out here earlier this year. I feel like lots of times there's a balance between fantastical ideas and then very practical ideas. And you may think that a teenager may come up with an idea that's really outrageous, but the students that I was working with mostly had very practical ideas. Some of them wanted to bring foods that were very common in Africa, make them growable in the US. Managing pests, for example, also was a concern. But I introduced them to the idea of designer pets, and they had a really funny reaction to them. They were just like, why would anybody want that? I was like, good question. I mean, it's not a question I have an answer for, but I'm sure somebody would want that. But for me, it was just interesting that where their brains went in the outset were very practical concerns and not at all fantastical. So
no one wanted to make a unicorn or a dragon?
They did not mention that.
Teenagers, in my experience, is they're a tough audience when it comes to biotech. You could present them with what we consider to be the most fantastical ideas, growing your phone, and then they come back with these really hard questions. Well, did the phone ask to be grown? Things like that. It's the hardest audience, but it's also the best audience because they're really going to challenge you in ways that we need to be challenged constantly. Now, one of the things about you, Karen, is you not only are designing for equity when it comes to these kinds of curricula, but you're also designing as much for creativity. How do you think about, from a design point of view, when you think about making technology, especially biotechnology, accessible and fair? What are the things that go through your mind as you're considering that?
Coming from an art background and not from a scientific background, I think that how I approach it is I feel we're all going to be affected by the technology. And so maybe trying to introduce some of the applications and a little bit of cutting through the jargon might be helpful. So that's how I approach it. I want them to be so excited that I want them to feel like they have a stake in it. So, I mean, there's a level of excitement where, oh, we get to create with this. And then there's like, oh, these new things can be part of our lives. How do we want our lives to look? What do we want to see? Instead of having your head down and actually working on it, what would you want to see? What would you imagine as being part of your future using biotechnology? Which I think with a lot of basic research, you don't necessarily think about the applications. So it's finding that balance between introducing the idea of designing with microbes with the more broader ideas of how that could affect our world.
Oh my gosh, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But I'm, again, learning a lot about you. And this is so crazy because we see each other all the time and probably just talking about the topic of the event or something like that. But I didn't know you ran something called Fallacy Bingo. I haven't experienced this, so now I want to experience it. But apparently it blends nightlife energy with logical clarity. So is there a moment from that experience that taught you something about how people actually engage with science or misinformation? What did you learn from doing something so fun?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about how that project came about. I was a SynBio LEAP fellow, and that was a program that was started by Megan Palmer, who is amazing and who I think maybe has been on the show at least once. But yeah, it was through the LEAP program that I met a bioethicist named Vika Benton, and we started collaborating together. And Vika is just incredible. And I might have glazed over this in the intro, but I have somewhat of a background in marketing and advertising. And as I started talking to Vika, we began to realize that there was a lot of commonalities in how we approach communication. And we came to the conclusion that there's a lot of confusion around ethics and how ethics are talked about. And we decided to come up with a kit. We called it Ethics in a Box. And Fallacy Bingo was the first project that came out of that, really the most robust, like the rest were like posters and infographics. But Fallacy Bingo was a proper game taxonomy that we came up with based on the work that she had done with her students at the new University of the VU. I don't know, I'm probably not saying that right, but in the Netherlands. So yeah, we came up with this taxonomy, and the inspiration behind it was, as I said, to try to introduce ethical frameworks to people in a way that was engaging and fun. And with my marketing background, I went through and looked at a lot of those definitions for fallacies and shortened the definitions and made them more concise and came up with some symbols and glyphs that would depict what they were. And we worked together to come up with some examples for each of the fallacies. And we were inspired to do this because I've already mentioned my interest in emerging bio grew out of the biohacker community. And there was always a lot of press coverage about the community that was very alarmist. And I thought that that was unnecessary because there were a lot of people who were doing interesting work in the space, and it just got completely overshadowed by a lot of the more clickbait type extreme examples of biohacking. So we really dug into that. Vika and I did. We dug into that and we were like, what is it about these examples that make people so interested? Well, they're emotional. They really play on your emotions and they make you really feel something and it gets you excited and like, okay, well, that's fine. That's something. So then what? So our idea was to come up with this game that would start to just highlight those moments where you're gripped by emotion, by something strong. And you can call it a fallacy. That was our thinking, was the fallacies are important and interesting because they make you feel something very strongly, either really positive or really negative. But there's a conversation underneath that. So that was the whole idea. And it was a tool for education initially. And then I was like, well, since I'd had the background with the Empiricist League and doing events in nightlife type venues, I decided to try it out at the Ace Hotel, and it was fun. It worked out pretty well. We had a comedian do a bit using only fallacies, and we had two journalists arguing about GMOs, yay or nay.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I would pay a $20 cover charge to come check that out.
It was free, actually.
Oh.
And it was a lot of fun. I was there. I took Tomas there, and Aaron Kim, our friend Aaron Kim, also came with us. And I think Cass, all three of us went and took Tomas there. And it might have been one of the first times Tomas was out on the town in an adult type of venue. But I think Fallacy Bingo is so important because there is so much I mean, you're talking about the emotion and how people's emotions are manipulated. And I'm thinking about the 1971 Powell memo that was written that really is what has led to the world that we live in now, this 50 years of changing the language and really creating these fallacies. The Democrats are these evil child mongers and really letting business take over and the way our government works. And a lot of it is based on that emotional connection that people have to the news that's being fed to them, true or false. So I think that there's a big audience for Fallacy Bingo, and all those events they have at Caveat that are those nighttime science events should open with Fallacy Bingo.
I actually beta tested it there. It was pretty fun. But yeah, I mean, it's not just the media, it's advertising, it's everything. Erum, you asked me how it felt. And I will tell you that for a while, I was interested in making it a proper game show. And then I was like, I think that I need to take a break from it, because once you're like in that headspace and once you're so aware of how omnipresent they are, you get a little bit overwhelmed.
And I think what happens too, I mean, I don't know if you had this feeling because you worked in advertising and marketing and I worked in PR. Everything is manufactured. Every storyline is manufactured. You shouldn't believe anything because it's all fake. So I think that being overwhelmed by it, it doesn't surprise me. It's overwhelming. And when you're exposed to the way that people are manipulated through everything, media, social media, et cetera, you want to take a step back and get away from it.
Yeah, it can be very intense.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
Okay, so now let's switch gears a little bit. You also founded something, Collab Futures, which I actually don't know about. And it's supposed to be exploring collaborations between scientists and creatives, which has really been what this conversation is about. When did you do that? What was the vision for that space and how has it evolved over time?
That actually, the project with Vika was the original impetus for that, just working with her. And she was my partner in initially founding that. But from that point on, I worked with other researchers on different types of games and activations. Nicola Patron, I don't know if you know her. She's a plant biologist at the University of Cambridge. We worked together on some stuff. She was also a LEAP fellow. She's an incredible person. And we worked on a game that was focused around plants that was part of that Collab Futures. But I mean, Collab Futures, it's really about encouraging collaboration between scientists and creatives. And it's not really to say that there's a shortcoming in either area, but more just to say that there's a lot of overlap. And I also worked on a research project with a woman named Christine O'Connell, who was, at the time, she was at the Alda Center for Science Communications. And again, it was the same thing with Vika, where we just started talking. We're like, there's a lot in common here between scientists and creatives. And I think a lot of ground could be covered if there were collaborations. And I think we put together a really, really robust research project that was, I think, the year before COVID. We had a plan to reveal it at South by Southwest in 2020, which was canceled. So we never got to do that. But the following year, or maybe 2 years later, we actually got to share our learnings. But I think the idea behind that was just to show that there's a lot of potential in collaborations between science and creatives, but there is not enough funding opportunities.
I love the idea of bringing gaming to biotech, and something Karl and I had talked about. Karl has talked about an actual video game of a cell and being able to be cells in a game, or a one-player video game. Maybe it'd be those games where people collaborate virtually. But I love games that are in person. I love Caveat because, so Caveat we mentioned before, and Casey Lardner was on the podcast, who is the executive director of GenSpace right now. And she has been on a science comedy trivia night. it hits on so many things. It's intellectual. People are curious. It's funny. And I think humor is something that needs to come into biotech more because, what does it say? Like they said, humor is the highest form of intellectual experience. And that's not the phrase. The phrase is something a little more clever than that. But I just love that you're doing that. I think more people need to pursue games. I always wonder, like, who created these games? I had thought of making a card game for entrepreneurship, but it was a long time ago. But maybe one for biotech. Who knows? Who knows? Do you have any plans to make any games or do any fun games in the near future?
I mean, maybe. I do think, though, working in marketing and advertising, I became really aware of how games are used to communicate information. And I'm like, why aren't we using that for science more? It makes things so much more interesting. So.
And memorable, yeah. And emotional. I mean, you get invested in a game. What they say is when you play a particular video game, you're really your best self, you're putting your best self forward. And you're doing challenges, you're doing your own quests. And video games really enable us to do all these things that bring out the best in us. And I think board games, Erum, to your point about social being more important, there's all these gaming places where you can go physically play games while other people are playing around you. I bet those things will become even more popular given this artificial intelligence-ation of the world.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've been saying in person is the new digital. We spend less time on the screen, spend more time with people or nature. And I actually feel bad that we're talking through like a digital screen because we all live in the same friggin' town. We should have done this in person. All right, we'll hang out soon for sure in person. But all right, let's keep the questions going. I mean, we're learning so much about you and we love hearing your perspective, especially because there's a lot of convergence happening in your world, right? So gaming, art, education, biology, policy, you're really hitting on all these different things and you give a very interesting perspective. And you're talking about creative collaboration, but what do you see is the biggest missed opportunity for creative collaboration when it comes to the bioeconomy?
In terms of opportunities for creative collaborations in biology, I mean, I think that from the Empiricist League, when I was doing that, I really think that opening up the field so that people who are in the sciences can talk to people who are not is super important. And so just creating different vehicles for that. I know there are a few things that exist in New York City, but in my experience with the Empiricist League, almost every time when we asked a researcher if they wanted to come and give a talk, a 15 minute talk at a music venue, like a place that's reserved for musicians and comedians, they would say yes, and they would be very excited about it. They want to talk about their work, but it's the framing that becomes a little bit tricky. So the way that we framed things with the Empiricist League was we put them under very broad human interest topics like food. And so we'd have somebody talk about entomophagy and GMOs and cultured meat. And so
hold on, what's entomophagy? Sorry, this sounds really cool.
Eating insects.
Oh.
Actually, we've had the Insect Food Fest in Brooklyn at least 3 or 4 times. I've gone to a couple of them.
Yeah, but it's one of those things where I feel like in a city like New York, people are always looking for exciting, interesting things to do. And you go into a place where you learn about these things and you don't really need to learn that much, just a little bit, or maybe even just be introduced to the idea. And then you feel like you've experienced something super special. I mean, day to day, you do the things that you do. You go to work, you go home, you make dinner, you do very simple stuff. So that element of surprise that can happen from interacting with somebody who's in a very niche field of study can be super exciting to somebody who's never been exposed to it. And I think that gets overlooked a lot. And I don't think it's enough I have a Substack. I love Substack. I love writing because this is a new thing that I just started this year. I love it. And I think that that's not really enough, though. I feel like changing the framework or changing the experience to a venue that is surprising makes people feel more open. For the scientists, it was a great chance for them to prepare their things for a broader audience and not feel like they were at a research convention. And they only had 10 or 15 minutes, so they had to really think very carefully about what they wanted to express.
I think it's hard. At Messaging Lab, we train teams of scientists on how to communicate more effectively. And there is this big disconnect in terms of like the way the public expects to be fed knowledge or information or emotion versus the way scientists communicate. And when you go to Caveat, most of the people that they're putting on stage are science communicators. They're specialists in a field, but then they've got TikTok or they've got Instagram or they've got a podcast. And so they can go up there and package a story. And I think that for many researchers who've never had to do that, that can be very challenging. So maybe between us, we need to come up with a package where we're like, you want to go on stage? Here's the 3 things you need to prepare for. We give this to the community just as something that, because everybody wants to hear from them and everybody wants to know more. I think I'm biased, but I think everybody wants, like you said, Karen, that experience. They want to have a little secret that they've learned that they can talk about to other people. And science really offers that. It's so rich, but we don't get enough of it on a regular basis.
Or I think what happens too is that lots of times science is conveyed as fact, like a big, huge finding, which that's fine, but it's always evolving. And I think with that in mind, conversations or being able to interact with someone about their work, which is why I find it important when I show my work to be there. I think we miss the process. We see the findings, the results, and that is always nuanced and it's always evolving. And I think that in some ways, that stamp of this is the finding, it's done, gives it an air of permanence that maybe sometimes does it like a disservice.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And we interviewed someone. He's basically using the interest and excitement that is around meme coins, but to bring it to science and allowing people to put money towards science and actually have ownership over a patent. But he's using this entertainment value. So one of the pillars of what he's doing is for entertainment. But it's also this idea of seeking truth rather than just a meme is like an empty thing. It's just a popularity thing, just like gambling. There's nothing really of substance there. But with science, there's substance and bringing people along a journey to find truth. And that's what we are always thinking about in the human consciousness. And like what I'm thinking about is what's true. And in this world of AI and misinformation, AI slop, everyone's seeing stuff and it's like, oh, what is this? Is this the truth? And you have to be more critical. I think it's way more important now to be very critical and to seek truth, which comes with science, not just passively observing what's happening online.
Yeah, I think you also hit on it too when you called it a journey. I think that's part of it too, is that it's always moving, evolving. It's a journey. It's not a stagnant thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Agreed. Karen, are there any specific biotech companies or technologies that you're very excited about artistically? And if so, what makes them compelling as a creative collaborator?
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, I can tell you some of the companies that I've collaborated with. For the BioBat show, I did a little bit of work with some decommissioned COVID testing Opentrons OT2 robots. So they were like liquid handling robots, and I used them to paint images of flowers, and that was super fun. It was a very cool process. That to me was like the synbio dogma come actualized, because I'm making an image, a digital image that is turned into like a living thing. That was pretty fun. And I also have been working with a startup from upstate New York called Triton Bio. And they have developed this incubator that takes photos of the Petri dishes as they develop. So I've been using them to make stop motion videos of my Petri dishes, and they're amazing. So those are some of the things that I've been working on lately, but there will be more.
Wow. I just love that you're like expanding your practice, bringing art and biology and automation together, and you're using these tools. It's not just for scientific research, right? Which is great for that, but these tools can be used for other things. And that's really cool. Are you talking about this work on your Substack? Where could I see some of this?
I do talk about it on Substack.
We'll definitely link to it in the show notes. And then I'm going to look this stuff up. I mean, I don't know. Do you post on LinkedIn? Because like, I don't know why I'm not seeing your Substack.
I've gotten into a place where I don't post that much on LinkedIn unless it's to go to my Substack. I also don't post that much on Instagram that much these days. For me, I feel like the context for what I do is very important. And I think for people who are interested in it, Substack is a better place. Plus, writing in that way has helped me to think about how I frame my work. So I started off just writing for myself and just being like, what is this work that I'm doing? Why am I doing it? And then just talking about that and how does this work connect to science? How does it connect to art? And so that's what I've started unpacking more and just thinking about about biodesign and design in general, and what that means today and what it meant in the past as well. I also talk about the books that I read and the movies and stuff that I see. So it's like stream of consciousness, but also orienting.
Wow. Well, that's a great advertisement for Substack. This episode brought to you by Substack. Hopefully we get some money from them. That's really cool. All right. So we can get to our quick fire questions. Are you ready, Karl?
I'm ready.
All right. Are you ready? Are you ready, Karen?
Sure. Shoot.
Okay, Karen. So what's one tool, either digital or analog or even biological, that you can't live without in your creative process?
I would say that the drawing is sort of at the core, which this is not really a tool, but drawing is at the core of what I do. And so, I mean, in some ways, colored pencils and vellum, because I do a lot of planning that way, and I do a lot of thinking, do a lot of studying that way. But of course, yeast and agar.
Yeah. Well, sounds like an analog person. So that's really cool. So one SynBio project you wish you could revisit with no constraints.
Okay, so one of my original projects that I got interested in with synthetic biology was the bacterial photography lab that is part of the BioBuilder curriculum as well. I would love to really spend some time developing bacterial photography. I think that is so cool and fun.
Okay, I'm going to look that up and see what the images look like of bacterial photography.
Yeah, we got to see it.
Wow. Wow.
All right, Karen, biggest misconception people have about art and science mashups.
The biggest misconception is that they are divergent. And I really think that there's just a lot of commonalities between art and science. And I just think it's jargon that makes it separate.
Here. All right. Final question. Okay. Ocean, Petri dish, or classroom? Which one would you say is your true studio?
Yes.
All of the above.
That's a great answer.
Also add kitchen and community lab. Yes, true studio. My brain is my studio.
Well, Karen, oh my God, I'm so happy that you were on and I got to learn so much more about you. All right, let's have a meeting because we got to plan an event. We got to do something fun. If you're still interested in that, there's so much that we could do. I mean, I think people are thirsty for in-person connections, being able to express biology more than just entrepreneurship. That's the world we live in, but to be able to see it manifest through art and games. Let's do it.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you, Karen. We really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Erum, what did you think of our conversation with our friend, Karen Ingram?
Well, finally, we got her on the pod. That was such an amazing conversation. When I see Karen, I'm seeing her in a context of a social gathering, right? I haven't had a lot of one-on-one, like we're just talking about work conversations. So to be able to hear about her experiences, everything that she has done and how she arrived in this world of biology and has really owned it, right? It's now a part of her thinking and doing. That whole fallacy bingo that she did, I would love to experience that. This intersection between biology, art, design, education, interaction, games. We need more of that. You and I have talked a lot about we need more in-person interactive gatherings. Let's get away from the screens. Let's get together. Let's have some hive mind. There's nothing like being in person with people and talking about these really big topics. Anytime we get together, we all get jazzed about what we're all working on. And I think it's time to collaborate more. So I just love this whole conversation. And I'm sad that it took us this long, but I'm happy we had her on now. I think it's a great time to speak with her and understand all the things she has done because they all play off of each other. And it's exciting to see what's coming next. What about you? What do you think?
I get to see Karen in these contexts where it might be a small interaction, or I described how Kristen and I had gone to see her at BioBat when she was showing her Petri dish flowers. And what was great about this conversation is you could see that Karen has done a lot. And she's worked very broadly across biotechnology, always with that designer lens. So I think that that's super important. And it goes back to something that we talk about a fair amount here on Grow Everything, which is the fact that convergence, super convergence, is our present. We talked about the future's here, but it's not evenly distributed. Well, the future today is super convergent, being able to bring together, I think in real life, IRL is really important, as you say, but bringing together different minds and having people understand what different people are working on and coming up with ideas based on that, I think is extremely important, especially in these polarized times that we live in. Having people come together to understand each other is more important than ever. And I think Karen is a shining example of someone who makes that happen through her art, through her writing, and through the work that she does.
Yeah. And through the education, I think that's so important, right? Before we started recording, we were talking about friends of yours and they're concerned that there's no jobs out there. And AI is taking our jobs. Yeah, it's maybe taking software jobs, but there's plenty of work to do when it comes to biology. And there's plenty of work to do when it comes to cleaning up our environment. There's plenty of work to do when it comes to cleaning up our politics. There's plenty of work to do when it comes to creating unique experiences that we just have not experienced before using biology. And so when Karen talks to teenagers and college students and inspiring them to think differently and bringing biology as a platform, it's incredible because then they start thinking like, you know what? I'd rather do this than sitting in front of a computer writing code. Or I can take this, and I'm starting to see a lot of friends of mine that have been software developers coming into biotech, leveraging these conversations with ChatGPT, Claude. My one friend just loves using Claude, and being able to have these conversations on creating a biotech application. You can have the conversation, then what? Well, you have to actually experiment in the real world. And what does that look like? Then you go talk to other friends, you go to community biotech hubs like GenSpace, what we talked about all the time because we love it so much. But other labs, other people just working together to be able to, yes, design on software, but bringing it and creating it in the real world. There's no limit of creation that can happen through biology and our imagination and the tools that we have today. So there are endless number of jobs, people. There are an endless number of jobs. Do not just sit there and be like, oh my God, there's nothing to do. Yes, you might not have experience right now in biotech if you are one of those people listening to this that are outside of the discipline, but you can get it very quickly. And listen to more of these episodes. There will be things that hit you over the head. And you're like, I have to do this. I cannot rest until I start this and create a plan. And then your days will be occupied with creating something that hasn't been created before. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
I agree. And I think that's where we should end this episode.
Did I just drop a mic?
I think you just dropped the mic.
Okay, well, that's the pod. Thank you for listening. We have amazing episodes coming up. Everything from talking to worms. We talked about tree communication. We're going to be talking about worm communication coming up and a lot more. That's a little tease for you. And of course, if you're coming to the BioFab Fair in London, look us up. And for those of you who want to really immerse yourself in biofabrication and materials, textiles, colors, all made through biotechnology, you have to come to the BioFab Fair in London. Use the promo code GROW10 to get a discount, and we will see you there. So with that, end scene.